Behavior modification. Not my favorite chapter. I like the other chapters better. The other learning theories better. This is behavioral and social learning theory. I don't mind Bandura. It's the older ones that I'm not a real fan of. But we'll try to get through it. We'll talk about Watson and Pavlov and Skinner, and then we'll get into things. Really interesting if you think about it, and most people don't because they like to pretend that education's been the same for an extended length of time. But of course, indigenous people suffered through the boarding school era. Something about the boarding school era that most people don't understand. While indigenous people were going through boarding schools, there was a large surge of immigrants coming into the United States. And because of that, they needed to educate a lot of people that didn't speak English very well. And so they started a program, a public school program, to indoctrinate these individuals into what it was like uh, to be a patriotic American. That's what they were trying to do anyway. And actually the idea was followed through in the boarding schools with the indigenous people. So a lot of things that happened to American Indians, to Native Americans, a lot of that also was happening to the immigrants at the same time. Not quite as severely, because there were so many that they certainly couldn't board them all. They couldn't board them at all. So they had to have public schools, and some of the public schools were pretty abysmal, and they were pretty strict. Lots of discipline, and the indoctrination was pretty much the same. So that's what was going on at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, up into the Depression. At that point, things kind of slowed down, and then World War II happened, and after that, of course, there was a surge of labor in the United States. But before that, they were trying to indoctrinate all these people coming into the United States. What was it? Between 1880 and 1920, 60% of all the people that immigrated to the United States actually immigrated at that time. A huge surge of people coming in, and most of them did not speak English. So they needed to indoctrinate all of these new kids. Most of them were ghettoized. They lived in communities, in towns, in cities, with people that spoke their own language. So it was a kind of an interesting time about what was going on. And at the time, of course, behavioral modification was the method of disciplining students. It was also used to attempt to indoctrinate. So some of the things that happened to indigenous people also happened to the new immigrants coming in. Very strict, and we're going to see that with behavioral modification. Learning refers to a lasting change in an individual resulting from experience. Cognitive psychologists might say a student increases their knowledge through memorization. Cognitive psychology focuses on an individual's ability to think and reason. A neuroscientist might say that the student formed new connections between cells of the brain. Neuroscience is just beginning to make meaningful contributions to the advancement of education. We might also focus on the student's motivation to study or the benefit of social relationships to support academic success. Like all historical events, the behavioral perspective emerged in a historical context. of course, all of this stuff happens in a historical context. The behaviorism came to be at the beginning of the 20th century. So there was a lot going on. The only theories out there were Freud's theories because no one else was doing anything with it. And then the behaviorists decided that all this thinking and feeling stuff was unnecessary. So they just wanted to change people's behaviors. Of course, if you're trying to discipline somebody, you don't really care why. You just want the bad behavior to change, and that's what was going on. When behaviorism first emerged, our society was undergoing widespread changes, which made it possible for this perspective on learning to flourish in psychological and educational circles. They had huge influxes of students coming in, immigrant children coming in. Many of these families were very large, 10, 12 kids in the family, 16, 18. It wasn't unheard of because there was no birth control. Birth control was against the law in the United States, as weird as that may seem. The Comstock Acts were passed, and one of the things, not only did they block pornography, which I'm not exactly sure what it would look like back in the turn of the 20th century, but not only did it ban pornography, but it also banned any information about birth control. Although this text focuses on psychology as it relates to education, the behavioral movement extended well beyond the classroom, and it did. Actually, it existed outside the classroom, and then all of a sudden they decided, hey, this is a good way to control all these people, all these students. In the late 1800s, the predominant school of thought in psychology was the psychoanalytic theory, founded by Sigmund Freud, and that's Freud to your left there. His theory placed an emphasis on internal events and subconscious thoughts. Freud believed much of our mental life was influenced by events occurring in childhood. This perspective thrived across the world for many years, but ultimately people became dissatisfied with the ability of this approach to account for behavior. In other words, the problem was they wanted to change behavior. Freud was finding out why they were doing what they were doing. He found out why they were doing what they were doing, but what these people wanted to do, they just wanted to change the behavior. They didn't care why. They just wanted it changed. Practical Americans, that's what they were. The Freudian point of view would focus on thoughts and feelings, particularly those impacted by childhood events the student may not even remember. This focus on unconscious thoughts lacked specificity and made it difficult to investigate and apply Freudian theory in a consistent way. The behavioral perspective emerged partly in reaction to Sigmund Freud's theoretical orientation, as well as to other theories of the mind prominent at the time. In the early 1900s, John Watson asserted that psychology should be objective and scientific, as opposed to subjective and theoretical. The work of that, and that's what Freud and his followers were doing. Their work was more subjective than theoretical. But Watson, very practical American, he wanted things to be objective and scientific. Watson proposed a new psychology that focused on observable events and behavior, called overt behavior. He asserted that inferring the existence of phenomena that occur inside a person, like thinking or feeling, was unnecessary and unscientific. And the reality is, of course, you can't measure thoughts and feelings. You can't. It's unscientific. Watson's ideas were appealing to many scientists, and research in the behavioral tradition spread rapidly. Behavioral researchers have uncovered several basic principles of learning, And there are many direct applications of this research, from education and parenting to marketing and business. And of course, marketing and business was huge at the time. And we are practical Americans, and all we want is money. In short, our understanding of learning is influenced in a significant way by the contribution of behavioral research. Additionally, the behavioral perspective has much to offer in the way of direct applications in the classroom. And one of the things that you need to remember, or maybe you really don't care, but one of the things, a reality for me was that, of course, I was educated in the 50s and 60s, and behaviorism was the major thought at the time. They didn't want teachers to be nice to their students. They wanted teachers to be strict disciplinarians. And the stricter a disciplinarian you were, theoretically, the more education your students would acquire. Behaviorists view environmental experience as the central force in learning. This means we behave based upon the experiences we have during our life. This leads to a focus on observable behaviors, or things that we can actually observe people doing. Recall that from a behaviorist perspective, internal mental events are theoretical and not appropriate for scientific study. And it is. It's difficult to measure thoughts and feelings. It's nearly impossible unless you can get somebody to spill the beans on what they're thinking. Using this behaviorally based definition of learning, researchers have studied behavior for over 100 years, contributing much to our understanding of learning. And of course, it has to do with behavior. And this is the English spelling of behaviorism. And that's where this comes from, this slide. And look at their strange, spooky eyes. Anyway, that's how it's spelled in England, and also in Australia, and Canada, I think. Students of behavioral theory must first begin to view the world as an endless stream of interconnected behaviors. Any given behavior is impacted by preceding events and will influence future behaviors. The behaviorist begins by picking out some behavior of interest. What is important is the behavior of interest is clearly defined. The behaviorist may attempt to figure out what events led up to the behavior of interest, as well as what happened immediately after the behavior. But remember, all we're looking for is something physical happening. We're looking for behavior. We discount anything that has to do with thoughts or feelings. The key terms used in behavioral theory involve a specific environmental stimulus, the response. Behaviorists are concerned with how much associations, the response that follows, and the potential association between the stimulus and the response. Behaviorists are concerned with how such associations are made, and how they are strengthened or weakened, and how they are maintained. Events leading to a response are referred to as the stimulus. Some stimuli play a role in the expression of behavior and are called antecedents, something that happens before, which simply refer to an event occurring before the behavior of interest and influencing its expression. Now, one of the great things about behaviorism and being a strict disciplinarian, when I first started in psychology back in the 70s, autism spectrum disorder, which was just called autism at the time, and they were only referring to the really severe cases. Autism was dealt with very poorly. As a matter of fact, many of the individuals suffering from autism were institutionalized. Most of them were institutionalized, and because of the way that they dealt with autism, most of the individuals since they were institutionalized, most of them never learned to speak, and most of them had difficulty interacting with individuals. And this is one of the reasons why the mental hospitals are so large. because they couldn't deal with them. One of the things that behaviorism taught us is that by using strict discipline with children with autism, you can get them to regulate their autistic behavior. The more you can get them to regulate their behavior, the closer to what you would consider normal occurs. And this has been a huge boon for individuals suffering from autism spectrum disorder. It's been amazing. As I said, when I first started in psychology, I've got an old abnormal psychology book, and if you look at it and you look at autism spectrum disorder, which they don't call that, of course, but if you look at autism, they'll tell you that 70% will be mute and will probably have to be institutionalized. Now that's the old days. Now it's relatively rare to see someone who is suffering from autism spectrum disorder being institutionalized. But back then it was very, very common. As a matter of fact, that's what the movie Rain Man is all about, is the fact that Dustin Hoffman's character has been institutionalized because they were afraid that he might hurt the other child. And the other child, of course, is Tom Cruise in the movie. Very fascinating movie. And Dustin Hoffman does just an amazing job playing someone suffering from autism. Behaviorists study how the responses are changed by the events that come after the stimulus. Events occurring after a behavior of interest are called consequences. Reviewing this basic approach to the naming the important factors in the ongoing stream of behavior, we first have the behavior of interest, which is called the response. It is often a good idea to begin applying behavioral theory by clearly defining the behavior of interest. Events preceding the response are called antecedents, and events coming after the response are called consequences. So we have a response and we have something before that is an antecedent. We have the behavior, which is the response, and then we have what happens afterwards, and that's known as a consequence. Using the first letter of each of the important terms makes the acronym ABC, which students usually find easy to remember: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. Classical conditioning is behavioral theory based on our ability to learn by associating events that occur in the environment. Using the terms from the previous section, the theory is based on the association made between a stimulus and response in our environment. This type of learning emphasizes the importance of learning through events occurring together in time. This co-occurrence of events, a stimulus and the response, is called contiguity. The story of classical conditioning begins with a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov, who lived until 1936, interestingly. But in 1904, he won the Nobel Prize for medicine. Pavlov was one of the world's most renowned scientists. His work on the physiology of digestion led to the Nobel Prize in 1904. And it was followed by additional outstanding achievements while he served as director of Russia's Institute of Experimental Medicine. And of course, this was before Soviet Union, which happened in 1917. His primary research focus was the investigation of digestion using an experimental method that allowed for continuous monitoring of organ systems in live animals. Related to this research, he began to investigate the causes of salivation in dogs. A colleague proposed that a mental reflex or an automatic response caused salivation to food. Through a series of experiments, Pavlov was able to show that sometimes salivation is learned rather than an automatic response. or an automatic process. Based on this research, he believed he discovered a fundamental building block of learning. His theory indicated we are born with certain behavioral responses to the environment. However, we can learn to extend this foundation, responding in new ways that are sensitive to the world around us. We may be born with a startle response. We can learn to startle to other environmental stimuli, such as the sight of a large dog. Pavlov called this type of learning classical conditioning, and he believed it explained the behavioral capabilities of lower animals and humans. Lower humans. Watson was strongly influenced by the work of Pavlov and studied many of his principles as they applied to the physiology and behavior of animals. As a professor of psychology at Johns Hopkins University, Watson also began to study Pavlovian conditioning in human infants. He believed humans were indeed more complicated than lower animals, but generally operated on the same principles. In 1913, he published a paper detailing his ideas, essentially founding what would become the behavioral school of psychology. This school was essentially a group of researchers who embraced Watson's perspectives on learning. This was an important event because this school of thought would dominate psychology for the next 50 years, dramatically influencing society through educational and child rearing practices. And this wasn't the most friendly science. I mean, remember, this is a scientific idea, an idea that we can create a world where science rules. So it wasn't the friendliest method in the world. As a matter of fact, if you talk to the people from the 1950s and 1960s, they'll tell you that discipline in schools, discipline by parents, was fairly strict. And you can thank John Watson for that. Thanks, John. Another thing about Watson, Watson was a bit of a horn dog. And I say that unaffectionately, certainly. He was having an affair with a colleague's wife, and he was saying that he was doing sexual experimentation. He was doing scientific research dealing with sex. It gets a little weird after this, but he got fired from Johns Hopkins University and went into, are you ready for this? Went into advertising. And so you can thank John Watson not only for the behavioral school of psychology, but you can also thank him for all these horrible advertisements we have on television. Because he applied to advertising what he was doing with humans. The process of classical conditioning begins with instinctive behaviors we do not have to learn, such as salivating at the sight of food, or being startled by the sound of a loud noise. Pavlov believed these were unlearned behaviors and referred to them as unconditioned responses. Pavlov used the term conditioned to refer to learning. Therefore, something that is unconditioned is something that does not have to be learned. In addition to proposing a term for behaviors that are unlearned, Pavlov also proposed a term for the environmental events that trigger the unlearned response. A stimulus that triggers an unconditioned response is called the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is defined as the environmental event that brings about the unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus and the resulting unconditioned response are the basic elements of classical conditioning. The idea is that through our life experiences, we build upon these basic stimulus-response pairs to create the complex behaviors typical of our species. Well, we won't go into that. I was just thinking something else about our species is that we are thinking and feeling species, not just a doing species. That's what always irritated me about behaviorism. It seems to take away your free will. The neutral stimulus is something in the environment which initially has nothing to do with the unconditioned response, like ringing a bell. That might irritate a dog, but he's certainly not going to start salivating just because you ring a bell. In classical conditioning, the timing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are extremely important. This pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is the basis for learning through association and is crucial for the classical conditioning process. Without this pairing, classical conditioning would not occur. The learned behavior response is called the conditioned response. Pavlov called this the conditioned response because it is the product of learning. The learning occurs through the pairing or association between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Their pairing caused an association whereby the neutral stimulus did not remain neutral. The formerly neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus, eliciting a new response. The conditioned stimulus is an environmental stimulus that brings about a response through the process of learning, and that's how we taught the dog to start salivating when he hears the bell. We tied the food to the bell, and once we ring the bell, now he salivates, whether we bring food or not. Following the initial discovery of classical conditioning, behavioral scientists turned to the question of how we are able to learn something in one situation and then apply that learning to another similar situation. This transfer of learning came to be known as generalization. Generalization is defined as emitting a conditioned response to a stimulus that is similar to, but not exactly the same as, the conditioned stimulus. Through the generalization, we extend our learning to situations beyond the context in which they were originally learned. And this is the case, if you look to the left, this is a case of little Albert. They trained little Albert liked to play with the rats, doesn't everybody? So as an 18-month-old child, little Albert played with the rats and just had a grand old time. And they decided that they were going to train him, they were going to condition him to be afraid of rats. So they would, anytime he reached out to touch the rat, they would clang a bar behind his head and scare him. And they didn't take that many times before little Albert was deathly afraid of rats. Now, what happened was he was afraid of rats. Why was he touching the rat? They were touching the rats because they were fuzzy, they were furry, and that's what he liked. He liked the furry. He liked their fur. Well, he generalized this fear of rats to a fear of anything furry. So now he's afraid of rabbits, he's afraid of dogs, he's afraid of his mother's animal skin collar on her coat. He's afraid of men with beards. He's afraid of anything that's fuzzy because that's what they've trained him to do, to be afraid of them. Discrimination involves being able to tell the difference between a stimuli, allowing someone to limit a conditioned response to the original conditioned stimulus. Generalization and discrimination are not necessarily bad or good. Sometimes we want students to generalize, applying something they learned to other similar situations. I was looking at the cartoon. I'm sorry. Other similar situations. Extinction is the elimination of a classical conditioned response. This is accomplished by presenting conditioned stimulus alone, making sure that the unconditioned stimulus is not present. Each presentation of a conditioned stimulus without the accompanying unconditioned stimulus weakens the association between the two, resulting in eventual extinction of the classically conditioned response. And of course, the example is they rang the bell every time they fed the guy, fed the puppy. All of a sudden, they stopped doing that, but they kept ringing the bell. And he kept salivating. and then he stopped because he wasn't getting any food. There's no reason, there's no tie now. And that's known as extinction. And that happens. That's how people fall out of love with each other, as weird as that may seem. Classical conditioning is primarily about a behavior and the earlier event that caused its occurrence. The theory, however, fails to consider the influence of events occurring after the behavior of interest. Classical conditioning focuses on the antecedents of behavior and the behavior of response itself. What classical conditioning fails to account for is the influence of consequences or events occurring after the behavior of interest on future expression of the behavior. Operant conditioning differs from classical conditioning in that it focuses on a different part of the behavioral stream. Behavior can be viewed as an ongoing stream with earlier events affecting the current behavior and current behavior affecting later behaviors. Operant conditioning theorists recognize the importance of this behavioral stream. Their early research was particularly notable for their departure from the stimulus and response focus of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is a learning theory focusing on how consequences shape the expression of behavior. Wait a minute. Yeah. E.L. Thorndike pioneered the formal investigation of the effects of consequences on learning. Through unique studies with cats placed in a puzzle box, Thorndike established the power of a satisfying result on the frequency of behavior. In these experiments, the cat had to negotiate a trapdoor using a string on a pulley. When the cats successfully opened the door, they were able to escape and eat. Cats who successfully completed the task were quicker to solve the puzzle box when they returned to the box later. The satisfying nature of getting to eat facilitated the cat's performance on the second trial. Thorndike's puzzle box research led to the law of effect. This law states that behaviors resulting in satisfying events increase the likelihood of the behavior in the future. The behaviors resulting in dissatisfying events decrease the likelihood of the behavior in the future. The law of effect became the first major principle of consequential learning and laid the foundation of another researcher who would forever change the face of psychology, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is one of the most recognized names in psychology, primarily because of his groundbreaking research in the 1940s and 1950s. The focus of his research was to extend the learning by association principles established by Pavlov and Watson, to include the principles related to learning by consequences. He believed that unlike learning by association, which is limited by the number of our innate responses, learning by consequences occurs by an individual operating on the environment in an infinite number of ways. Further, he believed that consequences of these operations produce changes in our future behavior. The other thing about Skinner is that they trained him during the war. He started all this during World War II. He was trying to train pigeons to guide missiles, guide bombs by correcting, by pecking a disc and correcting things. Of course, it only worked once, but but he was actually fairly successful getting pigeons to direct bombs. They never used it, of course. The focus on how we operate on the environment and the consequences of these operations led Skinner to define a new theory of learning, which he called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is learning based on how operants or behaviors are influenced by the consequences that follow. Skinner's initial research was far more controlled than the average classroom. He initially investigated the effects of consequences on behavior using a specialized mechanical device called a Skinner box. I'm going to show you one in just a second. Well, I'll show you one right now. That's a Skinner box. You see the lever and the mouse, the speaker, the lights, and the electric grid to electrocute the little guy if they need to. Most of these Skinner boxes were small enclosures suitable for a rat or pigeon, which included a device that allowed the animal to make a response, lever pressing or key pecking, and a device to deliver a consequence such as food, food tray, or mild shock. This extremely controlled environment allowed him to specifically examine the effects of environmental consequences on behavior. Largely through his research with animals, Skinner outlined several basic behavioral learning principles that went far beyond Thorndike's law of effect. Subsequent research by Skinner and others has extended his learning principles to humans in an almost limitless number of situations. And that's your Skinner box. Skinner's research further specified the relation between behavior and consequence. Similar to Thorndike's law of effect, Skinner demonstrated that when favorable circumstances follow a given behavior, the behavior would likely continue in the future. He called the process reinforcement. The favorable outcome occurring after the behavior is called a reinforcer. Skinner's research demonstrated that there are two types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement, and obviously the other one is negative reinforcement. It's called that because something positive is added to the environment to increase the frequency of a desired behavior. Giving someone something they want as a consequence for behaving in a certain way is a common practice and is easily understood. Its focus on positive events also serves to make this a particularly favored behavioral management technique. Positive reinforcement, however, is not the only way to reinforce someone, but it's the one that's the most positive, I guess. Negative reinforcement is when you remove something negative from the environment to increase the frequency of a desired response. Like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement is accomplished by creating a favorable circumstance. In this case, removing something negative or aversive creates the favorable circumstance. Removing something negative from the environment can be very reinforcing. Just as with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement increases the likelihood of behavior being repeated in the future. Both positive and negative reinforcement encourage behavior. Reinforcement is an important part of behavior, but creating reinforcing situations can be complicated. The timing and delivery of reinforcement is referred to as schedule of reinforcement. Reinforcers may be given after every instance of a desired behavior, or they may be given for only some of the desired some of the desired responses. For some of the desired responses. Reinforcing every instance of a desired behavior is called continuous reinforcement. Reinforcing only some of the desired responses is called an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. Although it may appear to continuously reinforce would result in more of the desired behavior, multiple studies indicate using an intermediate schedule of reinforcement results in more lasting behavioral changes. Ratio schedules of reinforcement require reinforcing a certain number of responses. The important point to remember about ratio schedules is that it is based on reinforcement of a certain number of responses. There's a whole paragraph. And I decided to just take the first sentence and the last sentence. And it turned out that they were the same. Ratio, number. Okay. Interval schedules of reinforcement provide reinforcement for the first instance of a desired behavior following a period of time. This schedule of reinforcement establishes a period of wait time during which no reinforcement is possible. The important point to remember here is that interval schedules of reinforcement are based on a predetermined period of time, every 15 minutes. That's how you take your medicine. You take it twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. Reinforcement schedules that remain constant are called fixed schedules of reinforcement. Compare this to a variable schedule of reinforcement, where the number of responses required for reinforcement varies. This variation typically occurs around a predetermined average. Fixed and variable schedules of reinforcement also apply to interval schedules of reinforcement. A fixed interval schedule assigns a constant wait period, perhaps 3 minutes before reinforcing behavior. A variable interval schedule requires the instructor to vary the wait period, perhaps by 3 minutes, followed by 1 minute, followed by 5 minutes. Combining the qualities of the ratio and interval schedules with qualities of fixed versus variable schedules results in 4 schedules of reinforcement: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. By convention, we typically denote the intermittent value by placing a number above the after and above abbreviations. A schedule involving reinforcement after every third response would be called an FR3 schedule. A schedule involving reinforcement after a time period that varies around an average of 5 minutes would be called a V15 schedule. Also, keep in mind that these intermittent schedules of reinforcement are simply ways to determine how reinforcers are delivered. The ultimate goal is to promote or encourage some desirable behavior. Fixed schedules produce a very different behavioral pattern. Under a fixed schedule of reinforcement, students begin to appreciate the regularity of the reinforcement schedule. That is, students can predict when they are going to receive reinforcement. A fixed schedule of reinforcement leads to faster initial learning and to an unstable pattern of responses. Fixed schedules produce rapid learning, but can be problematic because it also results in rapid extinction, elimination of the behavior, when the reinforcers are removed. Because of the fixed nature of these schedules, it is easier for the participant to notice when the reinforcer breaks the pattern and stops. This problem can be alleviated by carefully changing schedules of reinforcement, starting with a fixed schedule and moving to a variable one. Scheduling reinforcements is an important part of encouraging desirable behavior. Knowing what type of reinforcement schedules are available and how to implement them effectively gives teachers a valuable set of tools to help them establish an appropriate behavioral climate. Skinner was interested in how to increase the frequency of a desired behavior and how to decrease undesirable behaviors. Let's see, what is that? Punishment is an unpleasant consequence for a behavior which decreases the likelihood of the behavior reoccurring. Educators can use punishment to help guide behavior. Skinner's research actually provided evidence for 2 types of punishment. Presentation punishment involves adding something negative to the environment to decrease the frequency of an undesirable behavior. It adds something to the misbehaving child's environment that would otherwise not be there, and the student views it as an unpleasant consequence. My grandson played in a tournament this weekend, and of course, the presentation punishment in soccer is giving the other team a free kick. So you commit the crime, or you commit the error, you foul the other individual, and they get a free kick. And that is the presentation punishment. Another type of unpleasant consequence involves the loss of something desirable. This type of punishment is called removal punishment. Removal punishment involves removing something from the environment to decrease the frequency of an undesirable behavior. This is a fairly common practice in educational settings, and any removal of privileges as a consequence for unacceptable behavior is removal punishment. Some examples of removal punishment might include losing recess time or the freedom to sit anywhere in the classroom, and of course, in this case, the father X'd out the television, painted over the screen. So he's removing the television. Important components of consequential learning include the environment, adding or removing something from the individual's environment, and consequence, viewed as positive or negative by the individual behaving, and behavioral change. Behavior is expected to increase or decrease in the frequency in the future. To encourage the development of a desired behavior that an individual never produces, the teacher can use a modified reinforcement approach called shaping. Shaping is the reinforcement of progressively closer approximations of a desired response. Using shaping, a teacher would need to catch the individual engaging in behaviors resembling the desired response and begin reinforcing those behaviors. The type of reinforcer would depend on the child, but often simple verbal praise is all that is needed. As the individual gets closer and closer to the desired behavior, the teacher modifies the frequency of reinforcement to include closer and closer administration of reinforcement to the desired behavior. Shaping involves the application of operant learning principles in a complicated neutral environment. Extinction is the process of no longer reinforcing a given behavior. This is particularly relevant when the instructor wishes to completely remove the expression of a given behavior. Extinction is a simple process based on a fundamental principle of operant conditioning. People will not engage in behaviors without reinforcement. When the reinforcement that maintains a behavior is removed, the behavior will eventually extinguish. Eventually is an important word here because the research shows that use of extinction may initially cause the undesired behavior to increase rather than decrease. Any increase in behavior following the removal of a reinforcer is temporary. Without reinforcement, the behavior will ultimately cease. Cueing is a manipulation of the environment before the behavior of interest. It typically involves changing some part of the classroom environment, such as flashing the overhead lights or ringing a bell. The purpose of providing a cue is to let the students know that you are expecting them to start engaging in specific behavior, like settling down on their seats to begin a lesson. Another way you can help students know that you want them to behave a certain way is to provide a verbal command reminding them what the cue means. Prompting is providing a verbal reminder that a specific behavior is expected. A teacher may say, "I just rang the bell. It is time for you to return to your seats." It is typical to introduce both a cue and a prompt. Later, a teacher may wish to remove the prompt, using only the cue as the signal for the desired behavior. Applied behavior analysis is a professional field that has emerged to address the need for more formal and accountable application of behavioral principles. It is defined as a scientific study of behavior change using the principles of behavior to evoke or elicit a targeted behavioral change. ABA practitioners follow the basic behavioral perspective. They view behavior as occurring in a specific context, with relevant events occurring before and after a behavior of interest. Behavior analysis typically follows a basic procedure of isolating and modifying a behavior of interest. Record your baseline information first. Second, identify a target behavior. Third, implement treatment. And four, record and review outcomes. And there you go. ABA, this approach begins with the recording of baseline information. We talked about that before. This means all relevant information surrounding the behavior of interest is recorded prior to any intervention. Typically, the behavior analyst records events occurring before and after the behavior of interest. This makes it possible for them to determine which antecedents and consequences are contributing to the problem behavior. Once an adequate baseline is recorded, the behaviorist targets a specific behavior for a change and develops a working plan or treatment for how to modify the behavior. The treatment is implemented. Implementation of the treatment is accomplished through a specific set of steps, complete with requirements for recording results. Recording results in an integral and important part of the ABA approach. Proper record keeping allows the behavior analyst to assess the effectiveness of their treatment approach. The work of the behavior analyst is performance-based. This means that the behavior analyst is concerned with the actual behavior and the situational events impacting its expression. ABA is not concerned with vague or theoretical concepts like Michael is lazy or Sierra is impulsive. Concepts like lazy or impulsive are too ill-defined to be useful to the behavior analyst. What might be lazy to one instructor might be called daydreaming by another. What might be lazy to one? This is why ABA is concerned with the student's actual performance or overt behavior. ABA is grounded in the principles of behaviorism. Behavioral principles provide the working tools behavior analysts use to conduct their work. Behavioral principles are effectively applied to a wide range of settings and conditions. Reinforcement and punishment have both been used effectively regardless of gender, age, or culture. ABA is considered analytic because it analyzes a given situation and demonstrates how a given behavior is related to events in the environment. Rather than guess about the relation between different behaviors, behavior analysts actually demonstrate the presence of a relation by using the four-step process. By systematically applying a well-developed treatment and charting behavioral changes, the behavior analyst is able to demonstrate a particular democratic event. ABA is an applied field. It is applied extension of decades of controlled research. It certainly continues to change and evolve from continued research in the area, but it is primarily concerned with the application of behavioral principles in real situations. This is, of course, carries with it all of the challenges and ethical considerations encountered whenever research-based theories are applied. Behavioral analysts are well trained in behavioral principles, but also in ethics, constantly questioning whether their interventions are appropriate. Situated well within the applied behavioral analysis framework is the educational process of conducting a functional behavioral assessment. These assessments focus on the analysis of behavior, on what function a behavior is serving a student in their unique environmental circumstance. In general, a behavior specialist looks at what predictably occurs before a problematic behavior and what changes and behavior. Oh my goodness. What changes following the behavior. Environmental changes should stress the function of the behavior, not the structure. Additionally, events that positively set the stage, for example, time of day or during stress, rather than acting as an immediate antecedent of the negative behavior, are also considered. An FBA is designed to determine the function of a challenging behavior. This information can later be translated into actionable items for intervention. During the process of gathering evidence for a behavior's function, examination of how it may serve to escape something in the environment, get the attention of someone, obtain something tangible, or cause positive sensations is often the focus. Observation of how a behavior is suspected to function should occur across multiple instances and preferably settings. Without this repetition, it is difficult to establish. Oh, I lost my place. To establish that a proposed function is valid. I was getting my fly swatter. Effective intervention should concentrate on substituting a positive behavior that mirrors a negative behavior in terms of function. Operant conditioning helps educators create productive and positive learning environments. Some researchers and educators believe using behavioral principles to manage behavior results in significant problems. Criticisms of behavioral theory take many forms, but are generally about the following issues: focusing on external control of behavior, decreasing a student's self-motivated learning, ignoring the impact of a student's thinking on behavior, emphasizing good conduct over academic learning. Learning because it is enjoyable activity as opposed to learning for a reward is something most teachers would like to see in their students. Does external reinforcement decrease one's desire to learn? There has been some debate about this issue. Some studies have shown that although reinforcers can increase the frequency of a behavior, the behavior often drops below pre-reinforcement levels once reinforcement is stopped. Other researchers have found reinforcement has little effect on one's natural desire to learn. Behavioral principles ignore the potential for a student's thinking to impact their behavior. Consider your own behavior for a moment. Why are you reading this text? Are you being rewarded for your reading behavior? What about your thoughts and feelings? Are you reading because you want to learn, you enjoy the material, or you are scared about getting behind in class? Some have criticized behavioral theory because it ignores such internal factors as thinking and emotions. This is particularly striking given education's apparent goal to develop the way to think. Behavioral techniques tend to emphasize good behavior rather than learning. Although some behavior programs are designed to achieve an academic goal, often they are designed to modify a specific overt behavior, like aggression. Behaviorists focus on behaviors we can see rather than internal events, like thinking. It is true that educating in a behaviorally disruptive classroom is not productive. However, do we want to focus education on behaving well? Obviously, we need good behavior and good learning to create productive educational environments. The point here is that teachers need to be aware of the possibility of focusing too heavily on overt behavior when using behavior management techniques. Social theories of learning were developed to explain how our social actions change learning. Social learning theories study how observation of others impacts our behavior. They also investigate how we use other people as models for appropriate behavior. One of the most prominent of these social learning theorists, Albert Bandura, was particularly interested in the phenomenon of observational learning, which he believed played a central role in human behavior. Observational learning is simply learned by observing others. Bandura developed a program of research designed to outline the principles of learning through observation. One of his experiments has become one of the best known research studies in psychology. In this experiment, children observed someone else, a model, showing either aggressive or non-aggressive behavior toward an inflated doll that bounces back when knocked down, the well-known Bobo doll. And I had one of these in the 50s, back in the 50s, when he was doing his research. I actually had a Bobo doll that my mother bought us, hoping that we would take out our aggression on the silly, stupid doll than punching each other. Didn't always work. Later, the children were allowed to play with the doll. Those exposed to the aggressive model behaved aggressively toward the doll. Those exposed to the non-aggressive model failed to demonstrate an equal level of aggressiveness. This research suggested people learn not only through direct reinforcement and punishment, but also by observing others behave. The idea that observational learning does not require direct action or behavior on the part of the learner was a break from prominent behavioral theories at the time. Bandura differentiated between acquisition of behavior, learning, and performance, behaving, for the long future. This contradicted the behaviorist notion that learning is understood only through observable events and behaviors. This new conceptualization of learning required exploration of cognition or thinking and led to a new era of social theory. This research I went to sleep for a second. Bandura began to redefine behaviorally oriented theories, calling his new approach social cognitive theory. He used this title because of his emphasis on cognitions, or how we think and reason. Many research studies have supported and helped to expand social cognitive theory, and a number of other basic principles have emerged. One of the basic principles of social cognitive theory is that learning can occur when we observe another's behavior being reinforced or punished. Learning can also occur in the absence of any appropriate reinforcement of a model's behavior. If we observe someone's behavior being reinforced, we are more likely to engage in that behavior ourselves, either immediately or in the future. The behavior might be exactly the same or slightly better. Do I have time? No. I was going to tell you a story. Wait a second, what are we talking about? I can't think of it. I had a story and I can't think of it. Vicarious learning is learning that is vicariously influenced by the consequences another person receives. When you increase a behavior from watching someone else receive reinforcement, we call this a vicarious reinforcement. When we decrease a behavior because we saw someone else receive punishment, we call it vicarious a punishment. Bandura believed learning from models involved four key processes: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. The role of attention is quite simple. In order for learning to occur, we have first to notice or attend to the behavior of the model. Behaviors and consequences, whether they pertain to ourselves or others, occur around us all the time. Most of these behaviors go unnoticed because we do not direct our attention toward them. We also have to retain or remember the behaviors we observe in others. Bandura holds that we remember modeled behaviors by mentally representing them. Reproduction of modeled behaviors occurs when we call the mentally represented behaviors into action, resulting in initiation of what we observed. Imitation of what we observed. Finally, motivation determines which behaviors will or will not be reproduced. We not only remember a model behavior, but we also develop expectations regarding the consequences of that behavior. You all right? Reproduction of model behaviors occurs when we call finally motivation determines what behaviors will or will not be reproduced. This theory holds that we develop expectations about the reinforcement and punishment we might receive for certain behaviors. These expectations are based on our observations of what happens to others, in addition to our own experiences. Bandura proposed we learn from reinforcement and punishment when we understand there is a relation between the model behavior and the consequence. Learning involves not just behavior and consequence, but also a cognitive link between the two, resulting in an expectation regarding future consequences. These expectations impact the choices we make about our behavior. This differs significantly from behavioral perspective. The behaviorist saw behavioral predispositions as being driven by a person's history of reward and punishment, factors which are outside one's personal control. What this means is that social cognitive theory goes beyond the basic views of the behaviorists and considers internal thoughts as important factors in determining behavior. Social cognitive theories regarding the impact of thinking on behavior ushered in a renewed interest in how thinking influences the management of our own behavior. This potential capacity to direct our own behavior is called self-regulation and has close ties to the observational research of the social theorists. Bandura proposed we observe and reflect on our own behavior. We are constantly evaluating our behavior based on personal standards. These standards derive from our interactions with the world, beginning in the early years of life through our interactions with caregivers. As we grow and develop, these interactions become internally mediated as we engage in self-reinforcement and punishment, such as, I did a great job and feel proud of myself, or I failed at this task and feel bad about it. Such internal performance feedback serves to motivate and support behavior, but can also produce negative emotions like anxiety, worry, thought suppression, and fear of negative evaluation. These negative emotions are counterproductive and serve to decrease our sense of self-regulation. It is important for students to remember to operate from a positive framework, directing behavior toward relevant goals. Some goals may relate to social activities, others may relate to academics. Achieving goals requires successful management of our behavior. Observational learning has also been shown to play a role in the development of goal states. For example, in one self-reward modeling study, Bandura and Kuppers in 1964 showed that children would evaluate their own behavior and manage their own consequences based on modeled behavior. In this study, children participated in a bowling activity where they could reward themselves with candy. Half the children were exposed to models whose self reward were based on a high performance standard, while the other half of the children were exposed to a low performance standard. Those children exposed to a high performance standard model rewarded themselves on a similar high standard criterion, whereas those exposed to the low performance standard model set lower self reward criteria for themselves. This shows that we often manage our own behavior by giving ourselves rewards we feel are appropriate. Our standards for what is appropriate are shaped by people we observe. Another approach to modifying our behavior is to use self-management of consequence as a cognitive process. Researchers have found that self-management can be enhanced by altering our thinking about our behavior in addition to managing external factors, and that is it. Okay. Now, I went to sleep a couple times while I was lecturing. You might have picked them out, or maybe you just thought, "Whoa, what's he talking about?" Okay, I had a dream and I was thinking somebody was here and I started talking to them. Oh, that was weird. Okay, well, I'll talk to you guys again next week.